Live. Welcome, everybody. Hopefully, we'll have some viewers trickling through slowly. We've got some stalwarts normally who show up every episode, ask the great questions. So welcome, Tam, as always, and welcome, Sai. Really happy to have you. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me, guys. Nice to meet you tomorrow. Nice to chat again, Yuval.
Awesome. Just before we dive in, just for some housekeeping, Solidity Fridays is brought to you by Linum Labs, the premier Web3 development agency. They can take care of all of your needs end to end for producing dApps, smart contract code bases, and the like. And Web3 Sanctuary, which is your number one source for all things Web3 education, smart contract development education, and community building. So Simon really needs no introduction, but I'm going to do it anyway because it's always fun. Simon is the progenitor of the greatest South African Rand stablecoin we have, the only legitimate one we have, ZARP, and is also an OG in the space, has made a footprint on just about anything that matters in Web3. Sai, we would love to hear like a little high-level overview of your journey into tech, into crypto, Web3, and how you got here.
Sure. So really, my journey into Web3 comes from my background with open source technology and open networking, which has been a passion of mine for a very long time. Professionally, it was never something I was involved in. I was more of a media person and a journalist. I used to host a radio show on 5FM in South Africa about technology. But on the side, I was an admin of a Linux user forum back in the day, and was just obsessed with open source and open networking, and eventually did end up working with an organization called Go Open Source, which was started by Mark Shuttleworth in South Africa. Did some strategic communication work there. Got very involved with iCommons and the Creative Commons movement, and just everything open resource and open content and open networking and open source software, through to the launch of Ubuntu Linux and Canonical. And really, to cut a long story short, those worlds collided with the financial world in 2010 for me when I discovered Bitcoin. And got really excited about it because it was the first we had a value protocol on the internet. We had protocols for everything else, and we'd seen the disruption that they brought. Protocols for HTTP and that enabled content, and we saw what that meant for newspapers and traditional content houses, and the massive disruption that it brought to them. Contents like Silk and others that enabled IP telephony and video streaming on the internet, like what we're doing right now. And we saw the disruption that brought to traditional, sources of video and video media, telecommunications companies, etc. And so when I learned about Bitcoin, I was like, okay, well, now the financial world's going to get its turn. Now there's a protocol for what they're doing. And so the internet is now about to do to banks and financial institutions what it did to newspapers and telecommunications providers. So that excited me. I was never, I'm not an economist, I'm not a financial person, but I sort of had to learn what this meant for the world of money. And sort of that intersection is where I've been stuck since then. So I compiled the Bitcoin core software back then, tried to do some mining. It was already too early to mine on CPUs. Everybody was GPU mining by then, and ASICs were starting to appear. And then learned about Ethereum at a Bitcoin conference, actually. And at the time, I was working with an organization called BitX, which later rebranded to Luno, which is one of the biggest exchanges in emerging markets. And I sort of headed up product there. Just in the office, we became super interested with the idea of smart contracts and decentralized finance and what Ethereum would mean for this new scene. Moved from Luno through several organizations, and ended up starting my own company in 2016, 17, and ZARP, which is the stablecoin for the South African Rand, sort of came from that.
That's an incredible journey. I mean, you really watch like the emergence of some of the big ideas in Web3 and blockchain. smart contracts and DeFi. You've been here for all of it.
It's also a very left out a lot of
I guess so.
interesting things. Like for instance, you've written 2 books that I really love. And the one is Beyond Bitcoin, which I have to thank you for writing. My dad stumbled upon it, and I think we have 5 copies at our house now because he keeps giving it out as like Christmas gifts. And he's now so like Web3 pulled, and it's so great because my dad not only understands what I do for a living now, but like loves it, and he's also like he really believes in it. So thank you. I'm really grateful for that book.
That's awesome. Thank you. It's always a bit of an ambitious endeavor writing anything about Web3 because by the time you hit enter on the last paragraph, it's already outdated. So like, some of the protocols we mentioned, Bitcoin, which I co-wrote with Sidley, some of those protocols don't exist anymore. The book came out sort of before FTX collapsed. So it's very difficult keeping pace with the industry, but thank you. That's very kind. I'm glad the book has its value.
I need to adopt that strategy. My parents still want me to get a real job. So
just give them a copy.
Awesome.
Christmas is coming up.
Great plan. Amazing. And so you have been involved also in like the kind of early 2000s internet cowboys, like the Web 2 emergence even. And how did you see the transition between kind of some of the early innovations? You mentioned like telecoms got disrupted and some other big industries were being disrupted. Do you feel that the emergence of crypto and Web3 is just another equivalent example of open source disruption? Or do you think that this time is different?
I think it has the potential to be. I don't know that this time is different. I think there's a lot that rhymes with what happened in telecommunications and other industries that were disrupted by the internet. For example, I think we have to be honest that crypto still hasn't given the mainstream a use case that compels them to adopt it, especially in developed markets, North America, Europe. People don't have the kind of money problems that we see in the emerging world, places like South Africa and India, South America. And
right.
There are use cases for crypto that have emerged in these places. Sorry, Yuval, were you saying something? Have we got a connection problem?
No, not at all. Sorry. Please go ahead.
Oh, okay. No worries. So, like, for example, I was traveling in Turkey recently, and the prevalent use case for crypto there is USDT on Tron, which I was really surprised by. If you just look at the usage data, that's crypto's killer use case at the moment in emerging markets is people using USDT on Tron. And a lot of them don't even know that they're using crypto. They think they're sending dollars around, and they're doing it because their customers are asking them to, etc. And so I spoke to a lot of merchants in Turkey who accept USDT. They're quite happy to hold it. They're quite happy to send it. They don't know what Tron is necessarily. We could have a discussion about Tron and the technology and the interesting characters, if I'm being diplomatic, that are behind Tron. But the fact is that the narrative in emerging markets is around, low fees, high inflation environments. People want dollar value. It's onerous for them to get actual dollars, and USDT is serving a purpose. So it's very interesting when I kind of switch conversations from emerging markets where people are using crypto because they have a very real need to my friends in North America and elsewhere who, to be honest, are mostly just speculating and are yet to produce anything in their markets that people actually use. Web3 gaming is really exciting, but we don't have a single title that people would rather play instead of Diablo 4 or whatever they're playing. Like it just hasn't happened. Their messaging platforms, none of them have come close to eclipsing Instagram or X or any of the other things people are using. So Web3 has a lot of work to do to prove itself. But the one thing we do know people want is stablecoins. And the place we know that they want them is emerging markets. And the most important variable for the adoption of a technology that enables stablecoins is low fees. And so that's a discussion I'm interested in right now. And in terms of the rest of it, I think there's a lot of interesting things happening in decentralized finance. My view of the future is that everything gets tokenized and ends up on chain. Which chain is an interesting discussion. because I think Ethereum has a lot of work to do before it's usable by any normal person. We can have a discussion about gas fees and just the ridiculousness of that situation and the explosion of L2s, L3s, L4s, and how expensive they are already. But the here and now is stablecoins, and that's really where we focused.
Right, understood. And in your experience in emerging markets, what platforms are consumers generally using for payments? So you mentioned like USDT on Tron in Turkey. Are people using a sort of centralized UI for that?
A lot of Tron wallets, a lot of decentralized Tron wallets. And then the other thing I found surprising in our research is that a hell of a lot of people in emerging markets pay, so for better or for worse. And whatever happens to CZ Finance post paying these massive fines that there are now in North America, a lot of people in emerging markets are using Binance Pay. And again, it's interesting when you speak to them because they don't know that they're using crypto necessarily. They don't really care about crypto. They've just discovered Binance. I think Binance has done a really good job with its angel network and its outreach in communities. And Binance Pay works for them. So, there they go.
Interesting. I think that's perhaps another discussion we can open up around the recent happenings with Binance. There's a lot of controversy there. There's a lot of interesting factors. And I know you have some kind of very deep hands-on experience with all of the big players in that organization. So perhaps we can touch on that just now. But I would love to dive into your thesis on stablecoins and how your journey landed you at ZARP and maybe some of the obstacles and interesting things that happen on the way to today. So congratulations on the launch of Liquidity, by the way. I know that was about 2 or 3 weeks ago. Huge milestone for us in SA, and I think a great shining star for anyone aspiring to build in Web3 in this country. But would love to hear about your journey to get here.
Okay, well, let me do the last question first and then dive into some observations. So I'd say what we announced a couple of weeks ago is our collaboration with Old Mutual Wealth in South Africa. Right now in stablecoins, I'm a big fan in anything we can do on-chain and algorithmically, but the fact is that we don't have any algorithmic coins at the moment that you would see, for example, traditional financial institutions trusting. And what we see happening with algorithmic stablecoins is that they inevitably end up with a treasury that largely consists of a reserve-backed stablecoin, and then they peg the algorithmic coin to and then at some point you have to wonder what the algorithmic coin is what purpose it's serving if you could just be using the reserve-backed coin instead. And so the moment you go, all right, well, let's bank that one for now. We need reserves of actual cash or the actual asset that we're pegged to. Then it's like, well, how do we build trust around that? How do you know that if we say we've got X million rand in the bank that we actually have it? Okay, let's bring in independent auditors who can interrogate our bank balances without us and match that to on-chain token supply, and put out independent reports that we got no control of. Cool, that's a box ticked. But then where are those rands and who's looking after them? And so if you look in the US, for example, Circle, which is behind USDC, which is one of the biggest dollar-based, BlackRock. So BlackRock is the biggest partner in the USA, and BlackRock manages the treasury reserves for USD coin. And so we replicated that model in South Africa by going to the biggest asset management firm and the oldest financial institution on the continent, Old Mutual, and began a dialogue with them a couple of years ago about their involvement in treasury management and looking after our reserves for us. And if you fast forward, we now have Old Mutual Wealth on board, so they manage all of the cash reserves for ZARP. So all of the rands in the bank that back the value of the ZARP stablecoin are managed by Old Mutual Wealth. But they've taken it a step further, and they're actually providing liquidity to the network as well. So, if you're going to provide a stablecoin, it's not enough to just issue the coin and have rands in the bank. You actually need a flywheel in DeFi of liquidity available on Uniswap and other protocols. And Old Mutual is committed to providing us with liquidity in those networks, which is a massive step. And that's what we announced 2 weeks ago. But getting to the observations you alluded to, Yuval, there are a few things we've noticed. I'm not a maximalist, but I'm a big fan of Bitcoin still. And what we've learned through experiments with Bitcoin payments and the Lightning Network, et cetera, is that people don't want to spend their Bitcoin, right? They want to hodl it. They want to speculate on its value, but they do not want to go and buy bread and milk with it necessarily, because they perceive it as a form of digital gold, for better or for worse. And again, I'm not defending that opinion. That's just what we see in the market, is people don't want to spend. And so stable coins are the answer to that conundrum. People want to spend something that has a value that's familiar to them, that they can trust. And more importantly, merchants want to accept something that isn't going to fluctuate in price wildly between the time that you pay for something and them actually accounting for it. So stable coins are sort of vitally important to forming circular economies within crypto. And that's one of the reasons why we're so excited by them. That, and the fact that we don't think fiat currencies are going anywhere anytime soon. We live in the real world, and things evolve, they don't revolve, and we're going to have fiat currencies for a while. And so if you buy into our hypothesis that a value protocol for the internet is going to disrupt financial services, but that fiat currencies are also going to be around, and that increasingly we're going to see the tokenization of all real world assets on chain. I honestly believe that it's not going to be too long before you're trading stocks, commodities, and everything else in the world, on chain in some form. Then you need stable coins. They're just a vital part of the industry. And again, you don't have to take my word for it. Just look at the data. It's the number one use case for crypto, is people sending stable coins around on Tron. Can't believe that word comes out of my mouth every time I say it. In emerging markets.
Yeah, I mean, stable coins really have proven to be the only killer application we've had so far. But yeah, I think it's fascinating what you're saying around people not wanting to spend their Bitcoin. Do you think that the Bitcoin as a store of value thesis is like a self-fulfilling market narrative at this point? Or do you think that there's some merit to that?
Yeah, it's interesting because one has to kind of forget about technology, look at anthropologically and how humans see value and the history of that. Money is such an ancient ingrained part of our species and the way that we interact. In my first book, In Math We Trust, I made the claim that it's the second most important invention we have after language, and I stand by that. Language was the first thing we invented that really gave us superpowers to interact with each other. And the second thing was money. How do we transfer value? All money is basically an IOU note. And we've been doing this for very long, with seashells, with baboon bones, with tally sticks in ancient England, and now with crypto. But if you look at the evolution of any new money, especially when it's not being brought to the world by a central bank, it follows a certain kind of set of processes that are sort of inevitable, and one that is established value, which Bitcoin in a way to doing. I mean, if you look just at price performance over the last 10 years, we all know the story. It's astronomical, and nobody's lost money over that time frame. But if you zoom into the day-to-day, like, the price is heavily volatile, and so that's just a natural part of its evolution. It's a perception, of course, because you could argue that one Bitcoin is always worth one Bitcoin, and it's actually the dollar that's been volatile. But in the real world, people think in dollars, they think in rands. And so if they've bought something because the narrative around it is that it's going to appreciate in value over the long term, and they're going to get a lot more back than they put in, why would they want to use that thing to buy beer and whatever else they're doing? So again, it's not a technology discussion. It's not even necessarily an economic discussion. It's just human nature and the way that we perceive value and the way we think about where we are. The fact that somebody's Ethereum into ZARP and then spending it immediately, you might say, well, you could have just spent the Ethereum, and that's true. But psychologically, they want to know that they are spending rands at the store. And merchants especially don't want to sell you a loaf of bread and then wake up tomorrow and the money you gave them for it is worth less than they paid for it themselves, even if it is going to recover in the long term. So, so all of that is just, I guess, the way money works. But I don't have an answer to your question. I think Bitcoin still has a very long way to go to establishing itself to, the world at large as a store of value. Medium of exchange is further out. I think it's going to accelerate, especially if we see these ETFs being announced in the States next year. I think that'll see a wall of money coming into Bitcoin, but who knows? I don't know what'll happen in the future. I just know how to get there.
Right, that's super insightful. I think it's interesting that you say that people cash out of Ether and Bitcoin and the like into a stable coin just to get around the psychological hurdle of feeling like they're spending an investment or an asset class. And there does seem to be a big difference between utilitarian money in the form of stable coins and good old X-ray pristine collateral money. But speaking of perceptions and human nature, I'd love to understand a little bit more about your journey with Old Mutual, what that conversation is like, how amenable they've been to crypto, if there's been bureaucracy, or how has it been walking that path with Old Mutual?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of see our organization at large, which is Invest Capital, which is sort of the holdco for ZARP. I see our job as really bridging the traditional financial world and the world of decentralized finance. And so I think, there are a lot of things in any industry that are counterintuitive when they're new to you, because they don't make sense, because you honestly just don't have enough knowledge to make sense of them. And a lot of what you as bureaucracy in that world, is there for a good reason. There has been exploitation in the past. There are a lot of boxes to tick, and some of them are necessary. Some of them shouldn't be there anymore. Maybe they were necessary 50 years ago, and we can argue about that. But for better or for worse, that's what it takes to do business with these big organizations. And so that was definitely our experience. I must give a lot of credit to the Old Mutual Wealth team. They've been incredibly progressive. They didn't just sit there and take our word for how these things work. They actually got their hands dirty and started playing around and setting up Uniswap pools and figuring out how these new markets work. And so I was really impressed with their engagement and their commitment to understanding the stuff, to trialing transactions with us and figuring out how this new world works. And so, things don't happen quickly in that world, but it has been a pleasure working with the team. They've really applied themselves to it, and I think we've ended up with a pretty special situation where South Africa, to my mind, now has one or two or three stablecoins in the world that has such a sort of established and tight relationship with a traditional financial institution at that scale.
That's amazing. I mean, Old Mutual truly is a household name, I think, across most of the continent. Truly impressive and established institution. And it's really promising for us degens that are like native to the space to see some of these institutions coming in, not just with capital. I mean, the institutional capital narrative now is a little bit tired, but engagement. I think that is really the operative word that you mentioned there, Sai. So we have a great question on the technical front from Sid. Sid Ahmed, thank you for joining in, by the way. He asked why you chose to deploy ZARP on Phantom in addition to Ethereum, which I think is a really interesting question.
Yeah, so a bit of background on that one. That deployment happened a very long time ago with V1 of our contract. And there were a few reasons for it. One is that we were working quite closely with Andre Cronje at the time. I'm sure most of the viewers of the stream will be familiar with Andre, but for those of you who aren't, he's a South African Web3 entrepreneur. I don't know if he'd like that title, but he's a developer, and he was behind YEarn or Yearn protocol, which really was one of the first big DeFi protocols that put DeFi on the map and got people talking about it. So he's a legend in the industry. He's, He's quite a controversial figure to some, but he was extremely good to us. He was very generous with his time and his expertise, and we could jet him technical questions when we were deploying our contracts on Ethereum, and he was just really helpful, really good to us. And Andre is also very involved with Phantom, and so he's a big proponent of Phantom. I think the kind of the DAG based approach to an EVM that Phantom has taken is interesting, and the fact that you get to finality so quickly on Phantom. And then obviously we have the bugbear of gas fees on Ethereum, which are just a joke at this stage, and that was something that Phantom for the most part had overcome. But more important than all of that was that we were deploying the first contract, there was a very strong narrative around DeFi that was building on Phantom, and a lot of players that we were used to hearing about in Ethereum were deploying their protocols on Phantom. And so strategically, we saw the DeFi narrative growing in Phantom, and we wanted to be part of that. Of course, that was then, and this is now, and the world is looking very different. This was before we had all these L2s. This was before Optimism had deployed, before there was Arbitrum. Polygon was around, but it was really early days. Solana was kind of just being born then, and these next generation L1s. So our strategy is very different today in terms of multi-chain, but that was the reason why we deployed it back then. That contract has been deprecated. We haven't deployed the new V3 version of the ZARP contract on Phantom yet. I think we'll get there. I think we'll be on any chain that is still around in the next 10 years. But that was the thinking back then.
Awesome. Thank you for that. Quick shout out to our friend of the podcast, Brenton. Brenton says, thanks for putting us on the map, Simon. Really also a wonderful individual doing a lot to push the space forward in South Africa. Mm-hmm. So I'd love to hear from a technical perspective. I understand you've had your fair share of commercial hurdles, and you guys have really walked the long road with some of the most illustrious FSPs here. But what has the technical journey been like for you and for the team developing ZARP over the years that you've been working on it?
It's been an interesting one. My co-founder, Kenneth Ings, is really a remarkable technologist. And he's just got this incredible ability to be both technically like one of the smartest I've ever met, but also an incredible mentor and leader, and somebody who developers would kill to work with, because they just learn so much from working with him. And so Kenny leads our technology team, and there's a lot of very deep experience there in fintech more generally, so building core banking systems and the like. But Web3 was kind of new to us because it didn't exist when we started working in the space, and so there was a little bit of learning required, understanding the tooling, understanding the space, understanding what it is to deploy on a distributed virtual machine instead of the sort of hosted infrastructure that we were used to. So that was part of the journey. And then I think also, for us, we see ZARP as an ecosystem. Retail customers are who we are building this for, but they're not our primary customers. So we see ourselves more as supporting developers and institutions that want to work with ZARP and take it to their retail customers. And so our technology decisions are very much led by that community. We've got a lot of Web3 app developers, financial institutions, startups that are getting hold of us because they're looking for a South African Rand stablecoin. They're finding us, and they want to integrate what we're doing into their world. And so our technology decisions are led by them. What chain do you guys want us to be on? What sort of APIs do you need in our world to enable what you guys want to do? And then we'll construct a roadmap based on their requirements. So, again, back to the Phantom question, that was part of it, is we had developers, including Andre, going, we'd like you guys to be on Phantom. So we were like, we're in. Phantom it is. And I think the beautiful thing about that is that I feel like we're very in touch with how people are building and using crypto in the real world. and we're hearing their concerns. If you speak to the right venture funds on the west coast of the USA, you'll hear the most beautiful story about Ethereum. But if you speak to people in South Africa, Ghana, Zimbabwe, elsewhere, they're like, how am I supposed to use a chain where a basic transaction can cost me $5-6? It's like, this just isn't working. You're like, well, we've got an L2, and they're like, well, the fee's already $2 there. That's still too much, and now I have to switch between these two networks in my wallet, and maybe account abstraction will help that in the future. But then we'll get other developers coming to us and going, why aren't you guys building on Solana? It's a fraction of a cent. They've got isolated fee markets. It makes a lot more sense. And if you want circular economies, and if you want to enable crypto and payments especially, then not even Ethereum L2 is getting the cheese right now. Maybe L500s will one day. But really, do we want that kind of complexity in our world? So, there's sort of what I believe from a technology and a narrative perspective, but I also have to appreciate what's happening in the real. So I'm having connection problems.
Sorry, Sai, you just dropped off there.
Hear me. Sorry about that.
It was all clear until the last thing you said.
Just before you guys, and it was going to. It was probably something just about constructing.
We tend to top people's internet signal.
What people want us to, instead of what I personally believe from a technology and a narrative perspective.
Right. I think that seems to be the most mature founder's perspective, rather than kind of following your own narrative or your own take on the markets or the technology, or being a maximalist on anything. And that's always been something that struck me in our conversations together, is that you are a user maximalist, like a user experience maximalist, and not an ETH person or a Bitcoin person.
Oh, I like
You're
that.
wanting to actually leverage the technology.
I think you have to be. I mean, if you're gonna build meaningful products, you need to skate where the puck is going, and you are going to know about what's possible before your users are. And so you need to play in that kind of possibility space and kind of lead them into this new world on the one hand. On the other hand, you have to appreciate the needs they have. And if there's a clear technology problem that's going to limit you building a solution for those needs, which I think gas fees on Ethereum frankly are, then you have to appreciate that reality and roll with it. So I think it's a balance of both.
Awesome. And speaking of gas, I think that kind of leads us naturally into the conversation around Ethereum mainnet versus ETH layer 0s, layer 2s, layer 3s, as compared to non-EVM based chains and ecosystems. I would love to hear your take on this explosion of scaling solutions that are coming out. And I know Tamara is also an expert on some of the ZK EVM things going on in the scaling side of things. So perhaps we can get into that conversation as well.
Cool. Yeah. I mean, I guess at a high level, I've said a lot about it already. I love Ethereum. I was running an Ethereum node since the Frontier release. So, even before Ethereum went live. I think the foundation does a great job. I think protocol scaling is a fine approach. I guess, to be quite honest, I do feel a little bit disillusioned though, because, most recently we've had the merge, but before the merge, we've had sort of hard forks, soft forks, upgrades, EIPs, promising that they were going to fix the gas problem. And not only have they not fixed it, you could argue it's gotten worse in some cases. And so it's like, you know what, guys, there are a lot of other options out there now. So give us a call once you figure this out, but your L2s aren't figuring it out yet. There's a lot of cool stuff you can do in L2s. I love ZK technology. It's the closest thing to magic I think we have in mathematics. It's amazing that it works. I think the optimistic rollups are interesting. My concern, I suppose, if I'm going to be hypercritical, is that we are building a lot of complexity in. And in a lot of ways, this does start looking like the traditional financial world, where you start building all these layers and bridges and extra pieces of technology and things that, frankly, you shouldn't need. And so, I spend a lot of time with the sort of thinkers in the Solana space, and they honestly just make a lot more sense when they talk about isolated fee markets. I think proof of history is an incredible contribution to the space. And, it hasn't been smooth sailing. Ethereum's taken sort of a more measured approach, where EIPs roll out very slowly and people think very long and hard about their deployment and about sustainability and robustness of the network, etc. I'd say ETH's in the middle. Bitcoin's the most conservative when it comes to rolling out improvements. But I also appreciate that because Solana came onto the scene when it did, they had to get up and running really quickly. And so I think Tolly and the Solana Foundation did a really good job of getting up to speed and deploying really quickly. The price they paid for that is, the move fast and break things conundrum, where you had Solana going down, which is embarrassing. But they fixed all of that. And so now you've got a really robust L1 with transaction fees that are a fraction of a cent, even for complex transactions. You can go and do a swap on Jupiter, which is aggregating DEX providers like Radium and Orca, etc., Whirlpool, and you can do a complex swap between two assets, and it's going to happen in a flash, and it's going to cost a fraction of a cent. And that's just like the stop talking moment to me when I'm with my Ethereum friends. And again, this is my world. I love Ethereum. I want it to succeed. I'm a fan of protocol scaling. But it's just like, guys, stop talking. See what I just did? See how much it cost? Like, give me a call once you've got this figured out. Until then, like, I'm very interested. I'm cool. We are for the ride. Ethereum is still the primary deployment for ZARP. We're very happy with it. But like, there's a problem here for a big portion of the users that we want ZARP to get to. And you guys just do not have a solution for us. So wallet abstraction sounds cool. The merge also sounded cool. Give me a call when it's all working.
That makes sense. And in that vein, I realize you're not always hands-on with the code base, but and you'll be very humble about this. I know you have a very deep understanding of the code and what's going on with the smart contracts hands-on. What do you think about the ecosystem of building out smart contracts in Rust as opposed to Solidity? And more broadly speaking, what do you think about the Solidity and Rust ecosystems?
Yeah, look, I have to preface everything I say here with the fact that I'm not a developer. like I'm just not. And so take anything I say about these environments or languages with a pinch of salt. I think Solidity is massively powerful in its accessibility and on onboarding developers that haven't developed in Web3 before, but are coming from a background where they're familiar with JavaScript or TypeScript or those languages that are akin to Solidity. It's very easy to look at a Solidity code base and to understand it through that lens. That said, there is a fair degree of abstraction in Solidity that you won't find in straight languages like Rust or Haskell. And so I think, that's what makes development in Rust interesting. It's like arguing between C# and JavaScript. They're just very different things once you understand what they're doing. So I guess that's my 2 cents on the matter, not being a developer. I don't think there's a right or wrong approach. You could have a discussion around efficiencies. The SVM is if we get back to Solana again, is very different from the EVM in its approach. Smart contracts mean something very different on Solana, and if you're issuing a token like we are, for example, there's a lot of functionality baked into the L1 that you can just call on into your token. And so, whereas in Solidity world, we're reproducing a lot of standard code that, for example, OpenZeppelin has contributed to the ERC20 standard as one example, which is really cool. In the SVM world, you've got kind of, that set of variables baked into the chain, and you're just calling them. And of course, there are ups and downs to both approaches. Smart contract risk on Ethereum is kind of isolated, whereas if you've got a fundamental problem with any of these functions on Solana, that can be a problem for the entire network. So there are various ways to think about it, but I think that's part of what makes a multi-chain strategy like what ZARP has to have so challenging. Is you need to understand the differences between these virtual machines, between these environments, between how they look at token deployment and abstraction, and so the overheads for that are quite formidable. I mean, we're just talking about Ethereum and Solana. We're not even alluding to like Sui or Neo or some of the other next generation protocols, or what Stella's doing, because there's a lot of stablecoin activity on Stella. I mean, there's some that are just not that interested in talking about like Cardano or XRP, but whatever.
Right. I think that seems to be a super balanced take. So the right tool for the right job, basically. Everything has its unique value proposition.
Yeah. And then also the right use case, like the world we live in currently means that we're probably going to have to deploy ZARP on Tron. I don't have to like it. I just have to do it. The market has spoken. And if the market decides that we need to be on XRP, then actually that might be a bridge too far. But anyway, we'll give our users whatever they want.
Okay. So saying that, do you foresee a situation a couple of years down the line where different ecosystems, different protocols are used to provide different applications or utilities with ZARP?
Yes, I think the most interesting example of that to me is ThorChain. Where we basically got an AMM/DEX running as an entire chain. And that's very interesting. I really think ThorChain is a massive contribution to the ecosystem, because you've got cross-chain swapping happening now without bridges, which is massively powerful. Bridge risk is a big part of what challenges our industry at the moment. So the fact that I can go from, even Bitcoin to USDC on Ethereum using ThorChain, without having to use a centralized exchange, without having to use a bridge, that's massively powerful. And so I think that's my current favorite example of like if you want to call it an app chain. I'm not against that approach. I just think it's fairly limited. And I think that if you really understand what's happening in the space, the idea of centralized chains just doesn't make any sense. It's like, you could just use MySQL. But again, I'm generalizing. There might be use cases I haven't thought of where it makes sense. I'm yet to see a plan for a private blockchain that makes any sense. It's just wasting resources, basically. So I think if you're talking about distributed applications, then absolutely, I think app-specific chains can be interesting, if I was understanding your question correctly. But if you're thinking about building anything centralized, like just use DynamoDB, guys. Save yourself the pain.
Absolutely. That's advice that a lot of people pay a lot of money to get, I think. I never quite.
Well, no, they pay a lot of money for management consultants to tell them the opposite of that.
Right. To validate their bad idea to begin with.
Yes, exactly. The right advice is free on this one, guys.
We have a great question circling back to your experience on the commercial and sort of regulatory side of things from Stephen Sidley, or Sidley, I hope I'm saying that correct. Stephen is asking...
Who's my co-author on Beyond Bitcoin.
Any engagement from the regulators?
We have had engagement with the regulators. Yeah. We've had many discussions with the Reserve Bank, and we've also presented to their working groups. One of the first things, of course, we did when we started the ZARP project was to get legal opinions on our regulatory positioning. Obviously, our biggest consideration was the Banks Act, and our legal consultants were 140% sure that we were not contravening the Banks Act in any way. So that's a good one. And then more recently, as you guys probably know, in South Africa, the FSCA has sort of thrown a net over crypto assets, as they call them. and they've classified them all as financial instruments. So it doesn't matter what it is. If it's a crypto, it's a financial instrument in South Africa now. And so anybody facilitating exchanges or providing services with crypto assets needs to be registered with the FSCA. The window for doing that closed yesterday. So if you were an existing crypto asset service provider, as they're now called in South Africa, you had to have your license application in by yesterday. And obviously, if you're starting up a new crypto startup in South Africa, that falls into the category, you're going to have to apply for a license before you're allowed to operate. So ZARP sort of fits into that as far as we can see. I mean, everybody's still figuring this out, the regulators, etc. We are quite happy with the way this is playing out in South Africa. We've had very positive interactions with the regulators so far. So we're all figuring this out together. There are some fundamental truths about stablecoins that I think are still misunderstood by a lot of our fellow industry players. I think the regulator understands it, or I hope they do, but we have heard some very worrying opinions from other startups in South Africa. For one, stablecoins are not money, they're not currency, they're tokens that represent the value of something. So if you're buying a stablecoin, that's not an ex-con transaction. It just isn't. Of course, if you're cashing it out overseas, that's a different discussion. But if you're a South African buying a South African stablecoin with rands in South Africa, the right to capital is here, the rands are here, you probably hold your private keys in South Africa, whether it's on your phone or on a hardware wallet. It's just a rand transaction for something akin to a voucher that represents the value of a rand. So that's fairly obvious to us. We thought it would be obvious to anybody else thinking about it, but apparently not.
That's great. You've really done your due diligence, which is really good because it means you can make a good, successful project, which people really need. Hopefully. On the regulated discussion, you mentioned you got independent auditors to do independent reports, and I think that's great. But as well as that, would you ever consider doing like a zero knowledge proof of reserves library implementation? I know there's a library being worked on called DAPL, and some exchanges are going to use it to do a zero knowledge proof of reserves. So it's a proof of liabilities and a proof of assets, and then it balances out and does a verifiable proof. Is that something you guys would be interested in?
Absolutely. It's something we've been talking about already. Not exactly the same thing, but we've also been engaging with the team at Chainlink about on-chain attestation, etc. I mean, as you know, the complexity is that the on-chain token supply side of it is fall over log simple to implement. Like it's the liability side of it, and the actually, I suppose in a stablecoin, in the case of a stablecoin, your liability would be on-chain, but the reserve side of it, integrating with traditional financial institutions, which South African financial institutions are not the greatest at. That's where things get tricky. There are no APIs. And so getting numbers that you can trust via Oracle, into a hash on chain is trickier than one would think. Should be easy, it's not. So we definitely have projects internally to work on that. And also to help financial institutions do this. It's just not something that they've ever had to do in the past. So you can forgive them for not having everything up to speed yet. But, we're here to help. So, all of the institutions in our world that we're working with, we're actually willing to put some resource behind helping them get to the point where we could have on-chain attestations that made sense. But we're just not there quite yet. And I agree with you that zero knowledge proofs are the way to do it.
That magic math.
Yeah, one day somebody will be able to explain to me how it works, but I don't think the people even doing it are entirely sure yet. We just know that it does.
Yeah, sometimes I can do it. I don't know why or how, but it makes sense. But explain it. It's a weird one.
Yeah.
All the interesting things in tech these days are a black box, right? ML, large language models, ZK.
Yeah. I don't know how many people who just use technology appreciate that, though. I think a lot of people use ChatGPT and honestly think that the people working at OpenAI know how it works, and it's like they know how to make it happen. They know what chips to order from NVIDIA and what code to feed it, but what it does between then and writing a funny Shakespeare play about your friend, like, we're not entirely sure. And I think we're even less sure of why exactly zero knowledge proofs work. But that's the beauty of being human. We figure out how to do things before we figure out good for or what exactly is happening in the black box.
Right. Yeah, that's absolutely true. Frankly, I think there are many people who believe that there is some kind of a massive multi-100,000 person call center or customer support center where people in emerging markets actually sit and answer people's ChatGPT queries manually. And maybe
I'd like to hear them explain how they think anybody can type that quickly, but fine.
Interesting thing I did the other day was asking the co-pilot in Microsoft Edge to write a bedtime story with South African current affairs. Anyone based in SA, I would highly recommend you do this. It produces some very interesting results.
On that topic, and to bring it back to crypto, one of the things that blows me away about large language models like GPT is how good they are at translating any language. And because code is language, if you have a multi-chain strategy like we do, and you have smart contracts written in Solidity that you need to translate into Rust or Haskell or anything else, and especially if you're very precise and you handle sort of one function or one variable at a time, like LLMs are insanely good at helping you, what's the right word for it? Translate a code base, I suppose.
Transpile, I think.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. I've just been blown away with how good it is at that. And then the other thing I really enjoy about coding with GPT is it doesn't have an ego. So when you suggest to a developer that they could do something differently, they're like, what do you mean? And it's like, takes 2 weeks before they're like, okay, I'm just going to do it because I have to now. Whereas GPT is like, I'm so sorry, I'll try again. Could this be more secure? Yes, I'm sorry, it could be more secure. So just amazing also dealing with a developer that doesn't have an ego.
Unheard of in previous times.
Yeah. No strong opinions about how it should be tackling this. And amazing. Super apologetic, which I enjoy as well. I've certainly never been apologized to by a developer.
Yeah, humility.
You might get what you want from them, but you're not going to get a sorry.
Right. Nice to have a little bit of positive reinforcement there for asking for better code.
God can accommodate, but God does not apologize.
I'm going to use that one. I like that. So speaking of controversial topics, I would love to just touch a little bit on what you think of the recent happenings with Binance, what that means for us in the space, maybe what your take is as someone with experience on the inside there.
Yeah, look, to be clear, I was never on the inside, but I had a lot of dealings with Binance. And unfortunately, I can't say much about any of that. What I will say is that at a macro level and for the industry, I think that what's happening, it's good that it happened sooner rather than later. I think the longer we waited for these things to be addressed, the worse they would become in their impact. But if we look at it at face value, and again, this is just my opinion as an outsider, we are fairly certain now that Binance wasn't stealing customer funds, which is great, which means it's not an FTX. There were clearly mistakes made that are being paid for now, both with money and time. The fine is ridiculous. It's like, $4.2 billion or something all told. If you look at what banks get charged for facilitating, far worse. This does seem like a monumental amount.
That's a really good
point.
Yeah,
I guess my opinion is that I'm glad it happened sooner rather than later. I'm glad it isn't going to have the ridiculous amount of fallout like we saw around FTX. And I'm glad that, touch wood, as far as we know now, no people are going to lose their life savings because of this, which happened with FTX as well. So this is just a fundamentally different kettle of fish, and I think everybody appreciates that. You know, anybody who looked at what happened at FTX honestly knows that it had nothing to do with crypto. You know, just like the fraud that happened at Steinhoff had nothing to do with furniture. Nobody was like, oh, the Steinhoff guys, I'm never going to use a couch again. You know, like, no, it's just fraud. You know, the fact that
I love that
furniture
analogy.
was part of the mix is, you know, so I hope people understand that about FTX. Like, FTX was not a crypto problem. He was just another Bernie Madoff, you know. Whereas right. In the case of Binance, it's a little bit more intricate because there was enabling of you know, financial proliferation and terrorist financing and other kind of AML/whatever concerns. So it's a different kettle of fish, far less impact for the industry. So I think we can all breathe a sigh of relief, except for CZ.
Right. It has been mercifully low drama as compared to some of the things that have happened over the previous year or two, in the form of Terra Luna and FTX and all of the fallout around that. So I think you make a great point. Rather sooner than later, I think a lot of eyes are now on Tether as the next to fall. Do you think any of those concerns are founded?
No. If you had asked me 3 years ago, I would have said, I don't know. You know, I was a very early Bitfinex user. I remember the Bitfinex hack. Obviously, USDT came out of, or Tether came out of the Bitfinex fraternity. I think what a lot of people don't realize about Tether is that they're one of the most reactive crypto companies when it comes to law enforcement. In fact, they might be the most reactive. Like any law enforcement order they get, they implement immediately. So they'll seize funds in a wallet if it's been flagged, or they're very reactive to that. I think there's a lot of power in them being outside of the US. I mean, if you understand the system of corresponding banks that enable dollars outside of the US, you should be less happy with that setup. It means that the Fed has to make 2 phone calls instead of 1 to freeze dollars in a bank account. Like, you don't just get to hold dollars outside of the US and the Fed have no control over it. They really do, because you have to have a corresponding US bank. But I think that Tether has risen to the occasion in terms of proving their reserves. You know, they're not on the level of a Circle that's producing highly regular reports and attestations, but you know, every time they've had to come to the party in this regard, they have. And I mean, of late, this wasn't always true. In the beginning, it was far murkier. So I hope I don't get proven wrong about this in time, but I'm not worried about a Tether calamity. But I agree, it would be fairly devastating for the industry if it happened.
That is insightful. I think that's a very nuanced take, which I'm not normally used to hearing. One normally hears either, what did Sam Trabucco famously say? Tether is legit. You should check out their redemptions. We do a bunch of them. That was a couple months before he left, sold the top, bought a yacht, and then Alameda went under. So it's either overwhelmingly positive or people think they're total criminal enablers. It's nice to hear a little bit more nuance there.
I think the other thing, going back to the beginning of our discussion, is Tether has so much adoption in emerging markets. It's actually ridiculous. It literally is the most used crypto out there for payments and in, you know, with everyday people. And so there's a good percentage of the population of Turkey, of the population of Zimbabwe, of, you know, of the world that are holding Tether. And, you know, one can unpack what that potentially means for the network. Or I actually heard anecdotally, and this wasn't a conversation I had in Turkey, but someone I know was engaging with people in Turkey about their use of USDT and why they don't use USDC. And this person he was speaking to was more up to speed with crypto than most, and said, you know, USDC's lost its peg before and Tether never has. And I think we often undervalue the role of narrative that backs the value of things. And so, you know, whether or not Tether is super reliable, it has a name as being super reliable in, with millions of people around the world. And so to some degree, there's self-fulfilling prophecies there as well. If we all believe it's going to hold its peg at $1, then we'll help it do that, either directly or inadvertently. Of course, narratives aren't strong enough to overcome us finding out that they've literally spent every last rand in their treasury reserves, but we know that's not true either. In fact, they are so flush with money, it's ridiculous. I heard another anecdote that Tether has the highest ratio of revenue to employees of any company in the world. Like, they just make more money than, it's ridiculous. And we saw their financial results last quarter. Their profits alone are in the hundreds of millions of dollars. So there is a ton of cash backing Tether. In fact, there's probably way more cash than they would need to fully flush their token supply. So that's my opinion. That's what I gather from the market. But I have been nothing but surprised since engaging in crypto. So who knows?
Unfortunately, we're wrapping up, hitting up against our hour mark. I could keep this conversation going for another few hours if it was possible with schedules, but I think that's a great note to end on. May ZARP grow to the scale of Tether one day, we hope. And tied to that,
imagine the whole world using rands. Imagine the rand becoming the world's reserve
I was going to say,
it would be wild.
Yeah, that was a bit like that Max Payne situation where crypto fell apart and the dollar mooned end of last year or beginning of this year. That was like the exact opposite of the narrative. So who knows? Weirder things have happened. ZAR.
What is Elon Musk like saying? The most amusing outcome is the most likely. I mean, yes, he's probably wrong, but this would be a very amusing outcome. I mean, I'm here for it. If the whole world wants to use our stablecoin and make the South African rand the most relevant currency on the globe, once for your South Africa, let's make it happen.
Absolutely. Sai, it has been more than a pleasure to have you on. You're always so insightful. This has been a very different kind of episode for us, a little bit less technical, which is nice, just to get some bird's eye view understanding from people who really know what's going on in the space. Can't thank you enough. Tamara, as always, my incredible host, mentor, idol in the code space. Thank you so much. Thanks to our viewers that joined us today. Once again, just a shout out to Web3 Sanctuary, the #1 source of Solidity and other smart contract developer education, and Linum Labs, a Web3 development agency to fulfill all of your dApp building needs. Thank you guys, and we'll see you on the next episode.
Thanks, guys.